I had always loved the idea of camping alone in the forest. The thought of being surrounded by nature, far from the hustle and bustle of the city, filled me with excitement. So, one Friday afternoon, I packed my tent, sleeping bag, and some food, and drove to the edge of the dark forest. I parked my car, slung my backpack over my shoulders, and began my hike deep into the woods. The sun was still shining brightly when I reached a small clearing where I decided to set up camp. The trees stood tall and dense, their leaves rustling softly in the gentle breeze. Birds chirped happily, and I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I pitched my tent, gathered some firewood, and started a small campfire. As the sun began to set, the forest around me slowly turned dark. Night fell, and the forest became eerily quiet. The only sounds were the crackling of my campfire and the occasional hoot of an owl. I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag, staring up at the star-filled sky, feeling both alone and alive. Suddenly, I heard a rustle in the bushes nearby. My heart skipped a beat, but I told myself it was just an animal. I tried to relax, but the noise continued, getting louder and closer. I sat up, straining my eyes to see into the darkness beyond the flickering light of the fire. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response. I grabbed a flashlight and pointed it towards the bushes. The beam of light revealed nothing but leaves and branches swaying gently in the wind. I let out a shaky breath and decided it was probably just a deer or a raccoon. Still feeling uneasy, I added more wood to the fire and sat closer to it, hoping the flames would keep any curious animals away. I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched, but it lingered, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. Hours passed, and I finally started to feel sleepy. Just as I was about to crawl back into my tent, I heard footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, crunching on the fallen leaves. My blood ran cold. This was no animal. Someone was out there, walking towards my camp. "Who's there?" I shouted again, my voice echoing through the silent forest. Still, there was no reply. I grabbed a large stick from the ground, holding it tightly as I stood by the fire, my eyes scanning the darkness. Then I saw him. A tall figure emerged from the shadows, just beyond the reach of my firelight. He stood still, staring at me. I couldn't make out his features, but I could feel his eyes on me. "What do you want?" I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. He didn't answer. He just stood there, watching me. Panic surged through me. I had no idea who he was or what he wanted, but I knew I had to get away from him. I slowly backed towards my tent, keeping my eyes on the figure. My mind raced, thinking of what to do next. Without warning, the man started moving towards me, his steps quick and purposeful. My instincts took over, and I turned and ran into the forest, my heart pounding in my chest. The darkness was disorienting, but I didn't dare stop. Branches scratched my arms and face as I pushed through the underbrush. But I didn't care. I had to get away. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps growing louder and closer. I stumbled over a root and fell hard to the ground, pain shooting through my ankle. I scrambled to my feet, limping as fast as I could. I could see the faint glow of moonlight through the trees, guiding me towards what I hoped was safety. Just when I thought I couldn't run any further, I burst into another clearing. To my relief, I saw a small cabin with lights on inside. I limped towards it, banging on the door frantically. "Help, please help me!" I shouted, tears streaming down my face. The door opened, and an old man stood there looking startled. "What's going on?" he asked, his eyes wide with concern. "There's someone after me. Please, let me in," I cried, glancing over my shoulder. The man stepped aside, and I rushed inside, collapsing onto the floor. He quickly shut and locked the door, peering out the window. "There's no one there," he said, turning to me. "Are you sure you saw someone?" I nodded, still shaking with fear. "He was there. He was chasing me." The old man nodded slowly and handed me a blanket. "You can stay here tonight. We'll sort this out in the morning." I thanked him, my voice barely above a whisper. As I sat on the couch, wrapped in the blanket, I finally felt a sense of safety. The old man sat nearby, keeping an eye on the door. Despite my fear, exhaustion soon took over, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. When morning came, the old man and I walked back to my campsite. There was no sign of the stranger, but the fear of that night stayed with me. I packed up my things and left the forest, vowing never to camp alone again. The peaceful solitude I once craved had turned into a nightmare I would never forget. Before we get into the next story, if you come for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thanks. It was a dark and stormy night. Rain battered the windows of the old, creaky hotel where I worked the night shift. My name is Alex, and I am the night receptionist at the Moonlight Inn. The hotel had seen better days. Its once bright red carpets were now faded and worn, and the wallpaper was peeling in many places. There were only a few guests tonight, most of them already asleep in their rooms. As I sat at the front desk, listening to the rain and the occasional roll of thunder, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was too quiet, too still. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second feeling like an eternity. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the sound of the front door creaking open. I looked up to see a man standing in the doorway. He was soaked to the bone, water dripping from his long, dark coat and wide-brimmed hat. His face was hidden in the shadows, but I could see his piercing eyes staring straight at me. "Good evening," I said, trying to sound calm. "How can I help you?" The man stepped forward, leaving a trail of water behind him. He reached into his coat and pulled out a wallet, placing it on the counter. "I need a room," he said in a low, raspy voice. His tone sent a shiver down my spine. "Of course," I replied, forcing a smile. "Do you have a reservation?" "No," he replied curtly. "But I need a room. Now." There was something about him that made me uneasy. His clothes looked expensive, but old-fashioned, like he had stepped out of another time. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen his face somewhere before, but I couldn't place it. "I'll need to see some ID," I said, trying to stick to the hotel's policy. The man hesitated, then reluctantly handed me his driver's license. I glanced at it quickly, noting his name was Jack Harrison. As I handed it back to him, I noticed his hands were shaking slightly. "Room 13 is available," I said, handing him a key. It was the only room left on the ground floor. "Enjoy your stay." Jack took the key without a word and headed down the dimly lit hallway. I watched him go, a feeling of dread settling in the pit of my stomach. As the hours passed, the rain continued to pour outside, and the wind howled around the old building. I tried to focus on my work, but my mind kept wandering back to Jack. Something about him wasn't right. I decided to do a quick search online, just to ease my mind. What I found made my blood run cold. There was a news article from a few years ago about a man named Jack Harrison, who had been wanted for a series of violent crimes. He had disappeared without a trace, and the police had been searching for him ever since. My hands shook as I picked up the phone and dialed 911. I explained the situation to the operator, my voice barely above a whisper. They assured me that the police would be there soon. I hung up and tried to stay calm. The minutes felt like hours as I waited, listening for any sound from room 13. Finally, I heard the faint wail of sirens approaching. 2 police officers entered the hotel, their faces serious. "Where is he?" one of them asked. I pointed down the hallway. "Room 13. They nodded and moved quickly, silently down the corridor. I followed at a distance, my heart pounding in my chest. The officers knocked on the door. "Mr. Harrison, this is the police. We need to speak with you." There was no response. They knocked again, louder this time. "Mr. Harrison, open the door." Still nothing. One of the officers motioned for me to come closer. "Do you have a master key?" I nodded and handed it to him with trembling hands. He unlocked the door and pushed it open slowly, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The room was empty. The bed was untouched, and there was no sign that anyone had been there. The window was open, rain blowing in and soaking the carpet. The officers exchanged a look, then turned to me. "Are you sure this is the right room?" one of them asked. "Yes," I stammered. "He was here. I gave him the key myself." The officers searched the room thoroughly, but there was no sign of Jack Harrison. It was like he had vanished into thin air. "Call us if you see him again," one of the officers said, handing me a card. "And keep the doors locked." I nodded, still in shock. They left, and I was alone again in the eerie silence of the hotel. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about Jack Harrison. Where had he gone? How had he disappeared so quickly? I watched the security footage, but there was no sign of him leaving the building. As dawn broke, the rain finally began to ease. The other staff started to arrive for their shifts, and I explained what had happened. They were just as baffled as I was. To this day, I still don't know what became of Jack Harrison. Some say he's still out there, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike again. All I know is that I'll never forget that stormy night at the Moonlight Inn, and the strange man who vanished without a trace. It was a chilly autumn evening when my friends and I decided to explore the old abandoned factory on the outskirts of town. We had always heard stories about strange creatures and spooky sightings there, but were too curious to stay away. Tristan, Bobby, Sarah, and I thought it would be fun to see if any of those tales were true. The factory was a huge, crumbling building with broken windows and rusted metal doors. As we approached, the wind howled through the empty halls, sending chills down my spine. We squeezed through a gap in the fence and made our way inside, our flashlights casting long shadows on the walls. "Let's check out the elevator shaft," Tristan suggested. He was always the bravest of us, or maybe just the most foolish. Either way, we followed him through the dark corridors. When we reached the elevator shaft, Tristan peered into the darkness below. "I think I see something," he whispered. I leaned in closer, straining my eyes. For a moment I saw a faint silhouette, like a person standing there, but then it was gone. Probably just a trick of the light, I said, trying to convince myself as much as the others. Bobby, always the skeptic, snorted. You guys are just imagining things. There's no such thing as ghosts or monsters. We moved on, exploring the different rooms and floors of the factory. The place was filled with old machinery, broken furniture, and piles of debris. The air was thick with dust, and every step we took echoed through the empty halls. As we made our way to the upper floors, Bobby suddenly stopped. Did you hear that? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. We all listened, holding our breath. There it was, a faint rustling sound, like something moving quickly across the floor. It's probably just rats, Sarah said, but her voice was shaky. We continued, but now there was a sense of unease hanging over us. In one of the larger rooms, we found a makeshift camp. There were old blankets, empty cans.